Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday webinar. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. Before we begin our program, as always, I would like to extend my thanks to our events coordinator, Becky Parnian, and our IT support, Pete Novak, who's been here for the entire 2 years of being broadcasting through webinars or events and making sure that everything would go smoothly and accessibly. A couple of words of logistics. The entire conversation today will be 1 hour. You can submit your questions through the Q&A button at the right side of your screen. You submit your questions and I would read the question and pose them to our guests. We will have plenty of time for your questions, hopefully with a very engaged conversation about Professor Grigor's book. So without further ado, let me introduce our very special guest, Talinn Grigor, a professor of art history at the University of California, Davis. It is a sort of a homecoming, virtual homecoming for Professor Grigor here. She was our guest as a visiting fellow a couple of years ago. And we were hoping that we could host her in person, but unfortunately we continue to host our colleagues and friends virtually through these webinars. So welcome, Talinn. Her research focuses on the 19th to 21st century art and architectural histories through the theoretical framework of post-colonial and critical theories grounded in Iran and Parsi India. Professor Grigor is one of the most prolific scholars in her field, always with fresh ideas and novel interventions. Her books include Building Iran, Modernism, Architecture, and National Heritage under Pahlavi Monarchs, which came out in 2009, Contemporary Iranian Art from the Street to the Studio, published in 2014, and the amazing book we are discussing today, The Persian Revival, the Imperialism of the Copy in Iranian and Parsi Architecture. I had to show you this book. We were just talking about how beautiful this book is, both in content and in design and production. Her articles have appeared in the Art Bulletin, Getty Research Journal, Third Text, Future Anterior, Journal of Iranian Studies, and many, many other important scholarly journals. She is the recipient of many grants and scholarships, including Social Science Research Council, American Research Institute of South Caucasus, Aga Khan program at MIT, as well as Norman Roshan Sudavar, and of course, Mossavar-Rahmani Center at Princeton and Persian Heritage Foundations. Again, welcome, Talinn, my good friend and colleague. Here with us to discuss the book is Dr. Madhuri Desai, as Associate Professor of Art History and Asian Studies at Penn State University. Her research interests are in the area of South Asian architectural and urban history, with the concentration on the early modern and colonial periods. Her first monograph, Benares, Reconstructed Architecture and Sacred Space in a Hindu Holy City, which came out in 2017, is an in-depth study of the making of the city of Benares between the late 16th and early 20th centuries. The book was awarded the 2019 Alice Davis Hitchcock Award from the Society of Architectural Historians. Dr. Desai is currently working on two projects that engage the questions of archaism and formal revival in early modern South Asia. The first project, Creating the Mughal Temple, in which she examines how temple building practices coalesced around revised sacred cartographies, architectural innovation, imperial politics, and circuits of Indo-Persian cosmopolitanism. Her second project is concerned with buildings and cities built in the territories of the Maratha Federation during the 18th and 19th century. Dr. Desai is a recipient of fellowships from the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts, the Social Science Research Council, Yale University's Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Arts in London, and the Institute of Arts and Humanities at Penn State. So with that introduction, I would like to invite Professor Grigor to present the book for around 15 to 20 minutes, and then our colleague, Professor Desai, would discuss the book with Talinn, and after that conversation, we open the screen for your questions. Again, you can submit your questions through the Q&A button on the lower right side of your screen. Talinn, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Behruz. Thank you for this very generous invitation. It's wonderful to be back. And thank you so much, Madhuri, for not only being a discussant, but also being the reviewer for the book. That made it much better. Thank you. And thank you to the audience, to the center. So I'll, let me share my screen. So I started the book actually originates during my dissertation research, when I was seeing all these very bizarre looking, a little bit off in terms of aesthetics, these bizarre but very lavish surfaces. At the time, the wisdom was that it was all Reza Shah's idea. This kind of revivalism of neo-Achaemenid and neo-Sasanian architecture we see in the heart of Reza Shah's capital city. So I started thinking that I'm going to write a book from 1925 to 1979, the architectural revival that would include the 2,500-year anniversary of the Persian Empire by Muhammad Reza Shah. But the more I dug, the more I realized that the story, this is not the story. This is actually the end of the story. And the story begins much earlier. And in terms of geography, it's much more expansive. And so it got pushed back, and finally I started that story starts with the fall of the Safavid Empire in 1722, where contemporary Iran lost its sort of Orientalist allure, and ancient Persia entered Europe's visual discourses, and specifically art historical discourses. So eventually it evolved. For me, the fall of the Safavid Empire was this tipping point where Persianate culture no longer was a central ethos and carried its own aesthetics that was to be emulated. Basically, the book argues that the Persian revival as an aesthetic architectural style, but also an art historical style, parallel to what had happened earlier, the Gothic revival in Europe, was first invented as an imperial discourse and intensified, only to be adopted, appropriated, and owned by Iranians and Parsis as a strategy to resist colonialism and to assert a certain post-colonial identity. So I'll quickly go over the chapters. Chapter 1 starts in the late 1700s, and actually I got the map that you're seeing here from Princeton Library, and some of the, when I was a fellow there, so some of these images are from the period that I was at Princeton. Sort of starting to see how Persepolis becomes a center of art historical conversations, then I go through and look at very in details, look at the travel logs by artists and diplomats in the early 19th century. By the mid-century, we're starting to see an ancient Iranian art history being narrated by primarily European historians. And by the end of the century, we have a full sort of the discourse comes full circle with these exquisite visual, but obviously very inaccurate reconstructions of what ancient Iran looked like. In 1901, the Orient or Rome debate erupts, which was a Vienna-based debate, but involved most of the very famous art historians of the turn of the century. Strigovsky arguing that the source of Western architecture, particularly Gothic architecture, comes from Iran. His basic idea was that sort of taking the linguistic arguments, he argues that if there is an architecture, there is a race. So the second chapter then moves to Parsis, primarily in Western India, to look at how Parsis, slightly before the establishment of the official reestablishment of the British Raj, became a partner in building the British Empire in India as industrialists, as people who were integrated in some of the Western societies, for example, Freemasonry, and how the lay Parsis rise during this period to become the leaders of the community by commissioning buildings, precisely because there are external imperial dynamics that are changing for them. They're being privileged by the British, but also internally some of their things are changing. For example, the introduction of Hindu or Muslim domestic help in the homes where hearth fires were kept. So this meant that they start to commission huge number of temples, and they acquire these very public facades with Neo-Persian revival language. And also through their press, they begin to also publish histories of ancient Iranian architecture and art through travel logs like this, very meticulous, 3 different languages, typeset in a way that they match the reproductions. And the Parsis, they integrated into the empire. They became part of the leaders of the making of the British Empire in the way that many of their civil and educational and administrative commissions were in Neo-Gothic, but their temple commissions were in this Persian revival style. And they basically from the early 19th century to the late 19th century, these temples are become tenfold. And I do a stratification of them, classification of them, how they're different in terms of their architecture. So one of the big challenges of writing the book is that I'm not a Parsi, I'm not a Zoroastrian, so so many of the interventions or innovations of the lay patrons was in the dynamics of the internal architecture, how they're changing the internal architecture from the profane to the sacred, to the fire, where the fire can be seen. But unfortunately, I was not. So this was one of the challenges of trying to write about an architecture that you had not seen. And by the zenith of Reza Shah's reign, this architecture was imported through very heavy, primarily educational patronage, Parsi patronage in Iran. So then we see this architecture coming to Iran. So then the third chapter deals with the Iranian brand of Persian revival. So the Persian revival had two distinct brands. One was the Parsi one, and then you have the development of its parallel, almost separately, but parallel initially, but then they merge with each other later on. And so the Iranian story starts with Karim Khan Zand, although I'm arguing that he was taking several things from, several ideas from Nader Shah, whose ideas are coming from India during his invasion. But for the first time during Karim Khan Zand's period, we see these elaborate public displays of Shahnameh narratives in very specific visual language. And also the adoption of these stone dados, these reliefs that end up on mansions and palaces. Again, with these Shahnameh characters. Fath Ali Shah, of course, was very important in creating a court culture where several of his sons disseminated the revivalistic, the Sasanian reliefs. Again, public presence of this Persian revival architecture. And from the mid to the late 19th century, we see primarily in Shiraz, but also in Tehran, we see these mansions being built by the Qajar nobility with distinct revivalistic iconography, borrowing from the travelogues, from some of the Parsi iconography. Two texts become very important as blueprints for later dissemination and proliferation of this style. Jalaluddin Mirza's Nameh Khosravan and Forsat's Asar Ajam, both of them used Western art historical visual strategies. So it wasn't just about the text, but also presenting numerous plates that would then be a blueprint for craftsmen and patrons who are building these buildings. In 1889, Iran, this is a moment of schizophrenia in the sense that Iran is presented at the Universal Exposition in Paris with two pavilions. One is sort of the pre and the post-Islam is now becomes a discursive practice, actually. This is the pavilion that represents the ancient Iran, pre-Islamic Iran, with this concocted Sasanian chartah, but then it has its other side. By the turn of the century, during the Constitutional Revolution, we see specific reformists adopt this style and have this lavish facades with these medallions. And again, we're seeing the way that the copy is not being made by actually going to Pasargada, but actually is being made through the Name Khosravan Asar Ajam in this case, and then the interior dados are taken directly from Name Khosravan. So I thought it's very interesting that Iranian craftsmen and patrons, they're not going to Shiraz or Fars or Persepolis or Pasargada, but they're actually using these publications to reproduce this architecture. At the zenith of Reza Shah's reign, of course, there's a rapprochement between, so the style takes a distinctly racist connotation. Where I intended to start the story, actually the story ends, and Penn State University did an extraordinary job with the design of the book. I'm very grateful to that. But they gave me 95,000 words, so I had to stop by the abdication of Reza Shah. Mohammad Reza Shah's revival, I guess, either someone else would write it or I'll write it after retirement. But this was the kind of architecture now at the exhibition of 1935. Iran is represented through a completely Neo-Persian revival style. Most of the official buildings, administrative buildings, ministries, banks were built in this style, which now is being refined, perfected, because at the very same time, Hertzfeld is digging at Persepolis. So there is a grafting of this architecture onto archaeological knowledge, more accurate archaeological knowledge. And I also talk about how Reza Shah's, the royal body becomes important in connecting the ancient and the modern together in the way that he is in ancient sites, looking, inspecting Persepolis and other sites, and then he's inaugurating these buildings. The epilogue is my favorite chapter, but I'll just let you read it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so fascinating. I'm a little bit disappointed that you're not talking about the epilogue because it's so much fun there, you know. But I just give a little bit of a clue that is a lot of drinking is involved in the epilogue. So thank you so much. Professor Desai, would you please, I mean, again, you can have that conversation in any format you wish, but let's talk about the book.
Right. Thank you so much, Behrouz, for this invitation, and thank you, Talinn, for writing this wonderful book that I have enjoyed throughout its progression. And I agree, Penn State Press has done a fantastic job in terms of production. It's a joy to really hold this book and turn the pages. So Behrouz, asked me to really talk about the significance of this book. And I would take that a step further and say each chapter you do some very significant things in each chapter. You make these great interventions. Each chapter is a potential book. So I'll just talk about what I think overall is kind of a significance, is that you do a great job of writing a global art history. And we're all trying to do that, right? We've been trying to do that, and we do that usually by adding objects from various geographies, right? And we've struggled with that. All of us do struggle with that in various surveys or various other classes that we teach. But you do that very, very interestingly in that you pay attention to different agents, their objectives, in what is clearly an unequal world. But this unequal world is certainly not a flat landscape of inequality, right? That there are opportunities that each one of these agents has that are unique, and that they're able to be creative, exercise certain amounts of ingenuity, right? To really get what they want in terms of and certainly produce the kinds of buildings that they want to see, and what those buildings then mean for their own self-image and the making of their communities. So I think we could return to that idea of what how would you write a global art history? I think I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on that. But I thought we could go chapter wise, and I have some questions for you for each chapter. So in chapter 1, you talk about this this global art history of first, that begins in texts, which you say clearly every revival begins as literature, right? As the Gothic revival begins as literature, but then takes on this art historical guise. So it begins in the imagination before it becomes a picture or eventually a building. And you look at people like James Ferguson, the famous bogeyman of South Asian, right? The first South Asian, who wrote the first global art history of South Asia, I guess. And of course, your guy, Strazygowski, right? Who places Iran at the center of this kind of really a Western art history. And I think it's significant because you're looking at the historiography of art history, the place of ancient Iran in the European imagination. You do that through close attention to the genealogy of art historians, their methods, perspectives, preoccupations, prejudices. So for instance, the preference for structure, artisan domes, spaces over ornament, and nationalities, these competing nationalities, who are themselves caught in this unequal competition for empire, right? So whether they're British, they're French, Austrian, Russian, some of them have an empire, some of them have half an empire, some of them want empire. So it's also an unequal landscape. And of course, that intersects with contemporary discussions of race, and eventually, of course, the search of these elusive Aryans. Who are these Aryans? And this Indo-Germanic, right, faith, whatever that might be. So in that light, right, so you lay out that story beautifully, and then of course you lay out the story of what the role of publication, eventually illustration, architectural drawing, that makes these imaginations so concrete. And of course that's the beginning of your copy, right, the copy that takes over everything else. So I guess my question is, right, so what are the stakes? What are the stakes for art history, the art history of Europe, in this beautiful story that you tell in this first chapter? That its place in this changed world, the Europeans now are in positions of unprecedented global power, but they're also unequal. And, what does that mean for a global art history? That, of course, we're trying to change that because it's overtly weighted towards the Western, right? So how would you, I think you have some great ideas about how can this Western, non-Western, right, dichotomy kind of really come together and tell us how to write this global art history. So I'd love to hear what you think about
that. Thank you. You sometimes you read it in a way that I really appreciate the way you're reading the text. So that was actually sort of the crux of the question: how do we write? I mean, we talk so much about global this, global that, global, and then most of the time it's just sort of a tokenistic, let's just add Indians to this global conversation we're having about Europe, and that becomes global. So I found that method problematic, and so I think for us to shed this notion that so admitting that art history is a Western discipline and invention with its own particular methods, and those methods can give us insight into history. But at the same time, shedding our prejudice about agency and value, and especially aesthetic judgment. So I was on this project for a long time, and many times that I presented, people would tell me, you know, okay, this is great, the story is great, but what do you do with this really bad architecture? And so that made me think about, okay, so what is it that, what are some of the measures that exclude non-Western art being included in art historical discussions? And one of them is this notion of beauty or perfection, or, you know, the little finger wasn't done right. And at MIT, I was the slide changer for a seminar in my master's year, and they spent half of the seminar speaking about one drawing of one toe by Michelangelo. And so how do you give agency to your people regardless of where they're coming from, and not to attach? So the project started with me looking at these bizarre things that weren't done right the way that I was trained. But then I came to the conclusion that it's not what they are, beautiful, perfect, but what they do. Actually, what are these buildings doing for the Parsis or the Iranians who are building them, and how are they being read by the people? What is it doing in the larger context of colonialism and resistance to colonialism and narratives about self?
Yes. Thank you. That's you know, so let's talk about these bizarre buildings now, right? So as what you do in chapter 2, and I would say, are they bizarre? Are they just really interesting, right? That's there. Is it kitsch, or is it just eclectic, right? That begs the question. So talking about, you know, the Parsis, the Zoroastrian diaspora in primarily Western India, they were an elite to become prominent in the 19th century through the global trade in cotton and opium, right? As you lay out. And they are getting invested in the lives of the Zoroastrians that they think they have left behind, that they need to do something. There's this mission to do something, to save, you know, these poor Zoroastrians back in Iran. They're also well-versed they've gone to all the right schools, the clubs, they're part of the Freemasonic institutions. They've read the art historical literature, as you point out. They're members of the Journal of the Asiatic Society and read the journal. And so you also talk about the role of the places like the Masonic temple in this imagination of a new kind of fire temple, right? This new kind of religion. They're also trying to reform religion at back in India. And some of the things that you talk about, right? This kind of this distilling of this Western art history and its copies, its print, it's the things produced through print. You could see parallels in what's happening to Hindu architecture in South Asia at the same time, right? But this purification of what is right, what is something that you're now learning what is the right kind of temple, for instance. And you talk about like these are somehow mimic men, right? That they're kind of taking what they can get to kind of remake things for their own purpose. So I guess the question is like, you know, how do you see this? I mean, you point out very well that it's really not about judging taste. Is this good architecture or bad architecture? What does it do? But then we're also talking about a certain elite, right? These are names that would be recognizable in any history of South Asia of the 19th century. They're the names, the Kamas, the Petits, the Tatas, the Vadias, right? That they're so these are the elite. They're the really, really elite, the multimillionaires who built Mumbai, for instance. Could you tell us, say, the other side of the story that is really not part of your book and maybe not part of your project, but the kind of, the other Parsis who may or may not have bought into this project, who were not members of the, Freemasonic Lodge? And do you see some kind of resistance to this elite coming in, changing practices, telling them now what is a pure fire temple, a new kind of fire temple, and this clout of money? So
so within as this discourse is being created and negotiated, and the reformist laity is risen to power, there is already schism within the community, and then we see some of that reflected in the architecture. There's a split, and one of them continues to, or sort of intensifies, the building of these Persian revival buildings, and some of them don't, and they continue to build the hot architecture. So we see that. I was, again, as an outsider, I was never able to actually penetrate the community to speak about the communities. So my sources mostly were visiting these buildings from outside, and reading everything that Parsi Studies had written, and it was really difficult and interesting to see how Parsi studies, Iranian studies, art history, these are completely different fields, and often they don't. Only recently have they start to overlap, and another challenge was that in Parsi studies, the fire is important, and not the building. The building is just a shell. And so when I was going to, okay, this building was established this time, I was getting all these dates about the fire. And so, so I don't really have an answer for your question. Although you are absolutely right that this elite does see itself as the protectorate of Zoroastrians, quote unquote, back home. But then that very back home becomes very problematic in the late 30s, when Parsis are getting really involved in Iran, and then they get disappointed, and that and then that ends. So a lot of this all of this actually is happening in the discursive, it's a discursive conversation, and maybe that's why the elite voice is important, because they were the ones who got to build. They weren't the ones who got to publish. They had the presses. They had the
money, right.
The money. And you are absolutely right that I do see them as Homi Bhabha's mimic men, not only in appropriating architectural discourses, revivalistic discourses that are happening everywhere, particularly in India, but also they become a threat. In the mimic man tradition, they become a threat by perfecting that mimetics. I think two of the founders of the Indian national movement were Parsis. There were some of these guys. So
yeah. No, I think that's a great point, because they change too, right? As the discourse changes and as the power dynamic around them changes, they stop paying that much attention to Iran for various reasons and become Indian nationalists and become these model Indian nationalists. And you also suggest that there's resistance to some of their reformist activities in Iran too. There is a traditional priesthood that is, who are these guys showing up telling us how to build a fire temple?
Exactly.
So I think that's very interesting too. Which brings us to chapter 3. So each of these, as I said, could be a book, and strongly I would love to read both these books. I loved what you did in chapter 3, where you pay attention to what the Zand rulers are doing post Nader Shah's invasion of Delhi. That's a piece I've never heard of. And I loved hearing that story. And yes, absolutely, Nader Shah, after his invasion of Delhi, took away craftsmen, and those were craftsmen working in stone. They had worked on, all the stone buildings that you see in the Red Fort in Delhi or at Agra, and that he carried them, and now he's having them produce these friezes in stone from the Shahnameh, right? And that's really interesting. Speaking that you point out that the Zand had Persian origins, not Turkic origins, like the Safavid before them. Hence, it was important for them to mine that Iranian past. And certainly the Iranian past has been alive in Iran, the ancient Iranian past, maybe not in this Western art historical guise, but certainly are stories of the Shahnameh, certainly references to Take Jamshed or, Take Khusro, or certainly the Chartak as a model for perhaps the tomb going forward, or, the idea of the Talar as the hall, the kind of the hall. So in that sense, right, you point out then that something shifts in the 19th century, the early 19th century, which is the Perso-Russian wars happen, which is around the same time that the equation shifts for South Asians, really, where European cultural hegemony becomes the norm that you are to compete with. Things shift. I would argue that yes, things happen 1857 during the rebellion, but things are shifting for a lot of people even before then, certainly for the Parsis of Western India. And in that sense, like, you also see the racial discourse coming in, right? With the idea of who is Aryan. So it's very important, because in this unequal world, if you can get to call yourself Aryan, as the Iranians get to call themselves Aryan, and some Indians get to call themselves Aryan, and there's the struggle about who is or who is not Aryan, that is gold. That is gold. So you kind of try and capitalize on that. And so the question is, again, talking about, like, this is a certain elite discourse, a certain Western-oriented elite discourse. Perhaps we could talk about the place of Islam, because Islam is certainly very important both in Iran and in South Asia at the time, and remains so. And can you not be Aryan and Islamic at the same time? Nobody seems to throw up that possibility. Somehow, to be Aryan, you seem to have to not have anything to do with Islam, because of the racial, this kind of racial and linguistic coding of what is Indo-European and what is Semitic, or whatever these pseudo-scientific racial categories might be. So I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Both, in the mid-19th century, late 19th century, the Iranian reformists, a good majority of them were Muslim.
Right.
And my two examples, Jamaluddin and Khorsat, both were Muslim.
Right. And certainly the Pahlavis and the, right.
Yes.
Certainly they're not saying they're not Muslim, they're just downplaying it in a sense.
Right. And some of the other authors that other people discuss, I don't, because they don't have a visual component to their works. They did see compatibility between.
Let's see.
Again, other people have to answer that question, but who know those texts better. But in architecture, most of the revivalistic buildings that were built actually were built by Muslims, Muslim patrons. And I think this was a way, and you do see the resistance to it. For example, in Tabriz or Isfahan, we have practically no revivalistic buildings. So it does talk about the nuanced ways that Iranians themselves saw themselves in terms of regions and religious and ethnic and linguistic identities. And Shiraz was very important in part, and Shiraz and Tehran become very important geographies for Persian revival, precisely because there were connections to India. I mean, there were connections. That's the other thing, that when you were, you started your question discussion, that's one of the, I think, especially for art historians, we keep looking towards the West for answers. Whereas way before the rise of Western art history, there were so many connections continuously back and forth between India and Iran, and Nader Shah's case is the one. So actually I guess I argue that the Persian revival doesn't originate anywhere in Europe. Yes, Europeans are writing about these sites that they're fascinated, and they're reproducing it in transportable material, which is print. But actually, the Persian one, the Iranian brand of revivalism comes from India, and in this import of craftsmen who are coming to Iran, and then so constantly the story of Persian revival is a multi-continental, sort of stretching several centuries, very diverse identity agents, and a discourse that constantly shifts. It's never the same. I mean, what Karim Khan was doing is fundamentally, or all of them are creating similar looking buildings with using, constantly copying and appropriating the same iconography. But each of them has a completely different ideological meaning.
Right.
And that's very actually similar to Gothic revival.
Right. Absolutely. And there certainly there's this kind of this, you could also argue perhaps that the Persian revival had purchase in Iran just because these links were present for so many centuries and created this fertile environment for the reception of that revival. I'll just end with this, it's not really a question, but I love this as we are all interested in global modernism. I love this turn towards the modern, right, that you see also in the 1930s among a certain Iranian avant-garde in architecture. You certainly have, examples of sort of these Beaux-Arts buildings, Art Nouveau buildings. And I love this quote from this modern Iran architect from Iran, saying that, yes, we should value ancient Iran, but please, horses and bulls are best left at the zoo. So I think that's the turn towards, right, this kind of this mid-century modernism that then kind of takes over the story. So thank you, Talinn, again for writing this lovely book. I've enjoyed so much reading it, and thank you again, Behrooz, for allowing me to air my views here. So back to you.
That was wonderful. I mean, the questions and the conversation was so illuminating, and I'm going to open the floor to questions from our audience. And there's a question about your engagement with Raymond Schwab, if there is any engagement in the book on the Oriental Renaissance or the big elephant in the room, Said's Orientalism, and do you engage with those sort of takes on these forms of revival at all in the book?
It seems to me that Said has been served, eaten, digested. I mean, Said is everywhere, but Said, I don't actually I don't think maybe I quote him once.
Yeah.
But the whole book is about how Europe I mean, it's Saidian in the sense that the book tries to, in detail, spell out how the West invented its own fantasy about the ancients and produced a very rich visual material about it, and then how that was appropriated, taken over by Iranians and Parsis. So it's Saidian in the sense that it shows how the West came and did its thing, but then it tells the rest of the story, that Iranians and Parsis weren't just sitting there and doing nothing.
Yeah.
And that the bad architecture that we label as bad is precisely our own Orientalism. And if we can transcend our Hegelian aesthetic judgments, then we'll see what they were really trying to do.
It's really, I mean, it's so fascinating because you come back to this theme in the book as well, and you mentioned in your presentation this question of mimicry, and I really like the way you situate this revival simultaneously as mimicry and resistance, and it just produces both. And I wonder if then that sort of really corresponds to what Homi Baba is saying, or you're sort of taking it towards a totally different direction there, that if that mimicry is also resistance, can we call it mimicry? I mean, is it emulation, or this is reappropriation towards new kind of ways of resituating, especially in civilizational terms, as resistance?
So I think in Baba, the ambivalence is very important.
Right.
And I try to keep that throughout, to always know that you're on a shaky ground. It's always ambivalent. It's one thing, but it's also the other thing. And I think the figures, the characters that are engaged, it doesn't matter who, it's either Strugovsky sitting in Vienna or the Kamas sitting in Bombay or in Tehran. I think they themselves were constantly negotiating their identity through this production. And so I try to keep ambivalence at the center of the argument constantly, where you are mimicking, but also you're resisting. You are creating a narrative that is very similar, seemingly uses the same methods, but it's actually undermining the center.
That's right. That's right. So you mentioned Shirkovsky. There's another question there, that was he also interested in the question of Aryanism, or that question of racialized form was sort of pre-1930s, or this is pretty much becomes the core of ideology after that?
So Strugovsky, he had for 40 years, from 1901, when he was one of the one side of the debate, the Orient or Rome debate, to his death in 1941, his art history became more and more racialized. But even then, he kept changing the origin of where Aryans are coming from. First was sort of Lebanon, Palestine, that Near East, and then it moves to Iran, and then by the late 1930s is like somewhere in Tibet. So even that shows how these very certain arguments about race and essential identities were so malleable and changeable, and geographically they traveled and came back, and But definitely, he was one of the main components about this. If there is an architecture, there is a race, and he was the one who connected Indians, Iranians. For him, Armenians were important as a transition to the Germanic tribes.
Yes. And we have a course. This is so fascinating. We can go on talking about this, but there's a question on temples. Maybe this is a question for both of you, because Professor Desai also works on the construction of temples. Did the idea of a fire temple as a space change when it came to India? Was there a difference in spatial understanding of a fire temple in Iran as compared to that in India? Was fire temple really an architecture of religiosity, or did it actually have connotations of identity and selfhood? So maybe both of you can comment on that. I don't know. I mean, it's up to Professor Desai if you want.
I think this is a question for Talinn, because the question is from one of my students who is also working with Talinn. So I defer to Talinn.
So that's a great question, which we don't know the answer really well, because we know that we have some idea of the Sasanians having temples or fire, where the fire was at the center of this Chartah configuration. And then in the Iranian case, in 19th century Iran, we have home fires that were hidden, and this sort of very convoluted architectural space where the Zoroastrians were making sure that the fire is kept safe and it's not extinguished. So we don't really have formal architecture there by the 19th century. In India, the fires were initially in the homes, the hearth fires, and it's only with the economic capital and actually political power that we see with the rise of the Parsis that they start to build. Not only they start to build temples separate from the home, but also this very lavish facades. So the facades play a huge role. And they do change the processional architecture of the temples. That I'm arguing that was one of the ways to make it it's the architecture that enables the fire to be visible to lay people, which originally was only for the eye of the clerical class.
That's so wonderful. So we are at the end of our hour of conversation, and as I said at the beginning, this is an amazing conversation. The book is so fantastic, full of ideas and truly novel interventions in art history, architecture, and thinking about questions of global history. And that's one of the things that I totally agree with Professor Desai, that this is really at the broader, in the broader context, is an intervention in global history. And again, thank you so much to both of you. And hopefully one of these days we see you in person in Princeton to continue that conversation. Maybe with Professor Desai's next book, we can have that conversation here. So thank you again, and happy springs to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Behrouz. Thank you, Talinn. Great to see you both.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you both.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.